Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Aubrey Lyons. I'm with the Montana World Affairs Council, and we're honored to hear from Ambassador Mark Johnson this evening. Without him, we wouldn't be here, because in 2000, when he founded the council, he had a hunch that what happens around the world matters to Montana. And he was right. So here we are. To date, the council has organized more than 350 nonpartisan classroom and community education programs around the state. Everything from our Council in the Classroom distance learning video conferencing, which we had today with schools from Plenva, Prey, Freud, and Bozeman, as well as our academic world class competition, which is now the third largest in the country. We couldn't do it without all of you, and now more than ever, it's critical to connect our next generation of global leaders with the world around them. The council does just that, and it's only with the support of our generous donors and members. I'd like to especially thank the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, the Charles Engelhard Foundation, Stockman's Bank, Northwest Energy, Humanities Montana, Trails West Bank, and our outstanding board of directors and student interns.
Outstanding.
If you see value in what we do and you enjoy our programs, I invite you to show your support and become a member this evening. You can also join online. Our board has set forth a challenge where they will match up to $5,000 in donations between now and the new year, and we'd encourage you to show your support. If you're curious about other ways, we encourage you to participate in Giving Tuesday, where your donation will go towards our match. We also invite you to attend the Montana Professional Artists Association art show and auction that's happening this weekend at the Hilton Garden Inn, where 40% of the proceeds will be generously donated back to the council. As holiday season is upon us, I think we all know someone that might enjoy a council membership in their stocking. And if you're not ready to write a check tonight, you can sleep on it and just sign up for our news and events online so that we can engage you in our upcoming programs and events. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us, and I'd like to turn it over to our board president, the one and only Charlie Oliver.
Good job. Perfect.
I should have more sense to get up here after an introduction like that from Aubrey. Aubrey, you and your staff are just phenomenal. And I include the interns in that. What she didn't say, and everything she said about that, in fact, she kind of understated what we've accomplished under Mark's guidance, but we're probably, out of 90 councils, I would guess we're one of the smaller ones, Mark. And our programs are virtually unequal. And you heard what she said about education. We rank third in the nation in our World Quest. That's up against New York, Chicago, all over the place. And we're in a state with 1 million people. It's absolutely phenomenal. Within just the last couple of weeks, and I'd challenge any council in the nation, and we're not in competition, by the way, to do what we've done as of tonight, and that's to have 2 native Montana sons of great importance that have served our country well for multiple decades, that have lived all over the world on our behalf, you and me. And tonight is Mark Johnson. Mark's a 4th generation Montanan. And while I'm at it, he is married to, and where is she? Sally. She's right over there. Okay, Sally's taking a low profile. Mark's lovely, ambassador's lovely wife, Sally Cummings. Sally herself is an attorney advisor with U.S. Department of State. Ambassador Johnson got his education initially, at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He got his master's in international economics at George Washington University, and he joined the diplomatic corps of the U.S. State Department. He was initially assigned to Kuwait as commercial attaché, and even though the bio we have, and that you have here, it doesn't say it, but I know for a fact Ambassador Johnson served as commercial attaché in a place called Jakarta, Indonesia, where he and I first met in 1975, not knowing we'd meet again in 2000. And the message there, folks, is this is a small world. Ambassador Johnson, he served with distinction in a lot of places, particularly in the Middle East and Africa. Several countries in Africa, commercial attaché at the embassy in Kuwait. He was the first diplomat back into Kuwait City after Desert Storm. His job was to rebuild the embassy. He served as I forgot what the exact words are, but the Iranian affairs, the Iranian hostage working group during that era. He was right in the middle with that. He knows the Middle East, been actively involved. While he was in the State Department, he served as Deputy Inspector General with the State Department. He was awarded by President George Bush, the President Meritorious, I didn't get that right, Mark, I'm sorry. It's a real important service award. Before he came back to, he and Sally came back to Montana, he was with the National World Affairs Council, a vice chairman. And as you heard, he came here, he was a lecturer at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, and he started the Montana World Affairs Council. And we're really honored to be able to have our founder get up here and talk to us based on his background. Is a great honor for me. And with that, and I'm pretty sure Mark would like me to do this, I will hush up and welcome Ambassador Mark Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on behalf of all of us at the World Affairs Council. We really appreciate your coming out, your support, your enthusiasm, as you have done for nearly 18 years. And that's the reason, really, why we have made it to 18 years. It's because of you. I think it's phenomenal that our program is bigger than Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Boston. Number 3, and that is a tribute to the folks, teachers, students, and schools here in Montana. And frankly, we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more we could be doing. So again, welcome and thank you, and thanks to Charlie and Aubrey for their kind words and remarks. Now, those of you who have heard me speak before or know me may realize that one of the important persons in my life was our very own Mike Mansfield. We talked about native Montanan ambassadors. Mike Mansfield was right up there. And it was Mansfield's service in public affairs that inspired me to go into the Foreign Service. Now, those of you who remember Mansfield or have met him know that he was sometimes a man of few words, right? I remember I had just gotten my first assignment. I was actually up on Capitol Hill at the Mansfield office. He walked in, the senator, and he looked at me and said, "So, where are you going?" I said, "Senator, I'm going to Kuwait." Pause. Been there once. Hot. And after 3 years, what else could you say? But Mansfield said something else that has stuck with me, and in fact, it too was a kind of an inspiration when I founded the council. He said, "It's always better to hear what the other guy has to say." Now, I can't prove it, but I think he said those words during the Vietnam conflict. Surely those words are very appropriate in today's environment. Now, tonight I'm going to try and talk to you about America's foreign policy in the current age. Let me amend my remarks. I'm going to attempt to talk about American foreign policy. It's hard to describe that which does not exist, but that's never stopped me in the past. You know, I grew up in a world when, as a young boy in Great Falls, we didn't think much about the world. Didn't matter. Long ways away. The reality is, I find that kind of strange. If you, for instance, drive from Missoula to Great Falls, as you pass out of the mountains into the high plains, you will see at odd intervals chain link fences. What's that all about? Underneath are Minuteman III silos, intercontinental ballistic missiles, each equipped with thermonuclear warheads, probably the most powerful weapons in the world. That matters, I think. If you keep going, you'll come toward Great Falls and you'll see a lot of wheat, the Golden Triangle, one of the biggest wheat producing areas in the country. About 6 out of every 10 bushels are exported. How real is that? And we have tonight with us some friends from the Western Montana Military Officers Association, and we're glad to have them here. They know this, that in all the wars the United States has fought since the Spanish-American War, Montana has been in the top states in terms of percentage of our men and women who serve. I think a very remarkable feature. So it is important. And generally speaking, Americans are rather adverse, I found, about talking about foreign policy. They're like, well, who needs it? We've got 2 big oceans. We've got Mexico and Canada. You know, what could go wrong? And I think most people are surprised to learn that the United States has had a very long engagement. I'm going to just cover that briefly to give you a sense that we've been at this for a long time. The administrations of Washington, Adams, Jefferson were vexed very much by a situation in North Africa with the Barbary pirates who were seizing ships, taking our sailors and putting them into slavery. Even before that, the first ship left from the harbor of New York City, called the Empress of China, sailed off and went to the south coast of China, and that began a process of trade that has endured to the very day. There was another aspect of our engagement that I'll briefly touch on, had to do with individuals in the form of missionaries. First missionaries shortly after the Barbary War went off to the Holy Land, went to Jerusalem. 100 years ago, I find this very interesting, 100 years ago there were 3 million women working as missionaries in various societies. They had slogans like China for Christ in our century. Now we may find that very quaint today. The point I'd like to make is that these Americans made very enduring contributions to today's Middle East. Education, American University of Beirut. Most of the signers at the UN Conference on the United Nations 1945 in San Francisco were AUC or AUB graduates. Robert College in Istanbul. In health, one of the first Western hospitals in the Middle East was established in the northern Persian Gulf. Same thing in China. So we've had a long engagement. Now the question is, how did we get to the point we're in now? What's going on? In order to answer that, I need to give you a little bit history. You can tell already I am not a historian, but I'll do my best. We have to go back a little bit, not too long, just 25 years or so. I think it was Churchill who said, you know, the farther back you can look, the farther ahead you can see. This is the world that pertained in 25 years ago, more or less, give or take a few years on either side. Russia, Soviet Union, the evil empire, collapsed, vanished, crumbled, imploded. I don't think hardly a shot was fired. I suspect there were more vodka bottles broken. Not even a press release. China, China burst into the global economic scene led by a reformist leader, Deng Xiaoping, who had succeeded Mao. Exports from China swept across the world. It was seemingly impossible to go into any Walmart in the United States and buy something that wasn't made in China. You remember that. Europe, very promising. Creation of the United States of Europe, the European Union, common security policy, common budget policy, common currency, the euro. It was all very promising, and at that time all of us had the word globalization on our lips. That's what we talked about. And indeed in the Middle East itself, it was probably one of the most hopeful periods in the last 100 years. An effort that stemmed from the Madrid Conference led to what we called the peace process, a Middle East peace process, an effort to create a permanent state, two-state solution for the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. It looked very promising. Incidentally, the way that process was initiated at this Madrid conference, who set that up? There were two people. One was my boss at the time, Secretary of State James Baker, and the other person was his Soviet-Russian counterpart, Eduard Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union / Russia. The United States and Washington, Moscow and Washington, in other words, were collaborating in a way that we've never seen since then. So that's the world we had. No, by the way, 25 years ago or so, there was something new coming around. It was called, how did it go? WWW, World Wide Web. Yeah, you've heard of it. There were probably 10, 20, 30 websites in the world. Amazing, right? Well, that was then. What do we have now? Well, in Russia, we have the 21st century Tsar, Vladimir Putin, who is attempting, it would appear, to reestablish or regain the lost glory of the Russian Empire. Putin is everywhere. He's very present in the Middle East with his brand of nationalism. He's a handful, as we've seen. In China, China has just crowned its new emperor, Xi Jinping, said to be the most powerful ruler in China since Mao Zedong. Indeed, the London Economist said he is the most powerful man in the world. And make no mistake, China is moving toward the center stage in global affairs. We will see more of that in the years to come. Europe is not doing so well. Europe is coming apart. Brexit, Catalonia in Spain, nationalist parties in places like France, Holland, Austria, even in Germany. The Germans had an election a couple of months ago. 90 members of the far-right party, the Alternative for Germany, were elected. They'll be sitting in the national parliament. That's going to be a big problem for Chancellor Angela Merkel to fashion some sort of a workable coalition and to be engaged on the world stage the way that I think people would like her to be. So that's part of the world. And oh yes, the Middle East. Middle East. If hell had a theme park on earth, it would be today's Middle East. It's angry, it's broken, it's dysfunctional. States like Syria, Iraq, Yemen don't exist today as modern sovereign states. It's coming apart. Chances of peace in the Middle East, as they say in New Jersey, forget about it. Not going to happen. And a new dynamic that's worth paying attention to is the Cold War, or at least the war of proxies between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This too will be serious, and we see this playing out now in today's Syria and Iraq. And today there are something like, I don't know, 1.3, 1.4 billion websites, which if I were smarter, I would say this is really an astonishing development in the way it has shrunk the globe. And oh, I forgot to mention, 25 years ago, North Korea, you've heard of them, had a handful of rockets. Today, they've got enough enriched material to produce anywhere from 20 to 60 bombs. They're said to have intercontinental ballistic missiles. that can reach some portion of U.S. territories. Well, okay, that's kind of interesting, I suppose. Maybe, maybe not. So where are we today? That's what you really want to know. Where are we today? So against this turbulent background filled with tension, enter stage right, of course, the 45th President of the United States. Now, I know all of you have an opinion, all of you have an adjective. I'm not here to change that, to convince you, to persuade you. I will share with you two of mine based on my own personal experience. The first one I would use is unprecedented. Look, I've worked in the White House. I've been in the Situation Room, the West Wing. I've sat in the Oval Office with two different presidents. I have never seen anything like this. Hope I never will. Unpredictable. Let's just say that 24 hours in today's West Wing is an eternity. You don't know how the day will begin. You certainly don't know how it will end. But the reality that I want to impress upon you is that the 45th President of the United States must confront the world. He has no choice. Put differently, the world will confront him. And it already has happened. North Korea, for example. Moscow, Russia, and China also trying to test him and see what he's all about. And his threats, his challenges are numerous. Let's take a moment to review those. Global terrorism. We may say or think that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are receding. Indeed, they've lost about 95% of their territory in Syria and Iraq. That's a good thing, but make no mistake. These are resourceful organizations. They're agile, and what they will do is go underground and behave more as an insurgency group. We've already seen this. San Bernardino, Orlando, London, Paris, the streets of New York, and I would expect we'll see more of it. Rising powers like Russia and China will confront this administration, or at least challenge this administration. Russia, Putin is seemingly everywhere in the Middle East. A couple of weeks ago, he was in Iran. He just announced a big arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Very unusual. Strange people, strange bedfellows, it appears. China's building one of its first major overseas bases in the Red Sea in a place called Djibouti. Oddly enough, that base will be about 4 miles from the U.S.'s largest base in Africa, Camp Lemonnier, also in Djibouti. I do not expect there will be many social hours between the two sides. I'm just trying to give you a sense that the world is on the move, and our president has to deal with these. The global problems, not to diminish them or dismiss them, but things like the climate, things like cyber terrorism, cyber crime. All of these are problems that he's going to have to deal with. Now, every foreign embassy in Washington and every foreign ministry around the world that has any dealings with the United States, which mean probably just about every one, is asking themselves this question. Where's this guy coming from? What does he stand for? And if I were in their place in an embassy, if I were at the French embassy in Washington, that's what I'd be trying to piece together. I think I can safely say nobody really has a clue. It's very hard. This is going to be a difficult challenge. And no matter how many, it's going to be a difficult challenge. Let me just leave it at that. So what does he stand for? Can we make any sense of that? During the campaign and the primaries, seems like yesterday, right? I did follow this because I was interested to see what kind of a foreign policy, national security policy might emerge. And it did, either side, I think I had a better grasp of where former Secretary of State Clinton would be. Trump completely unknown. And I think three things have stood out. They certainly did during the campaign, and they are present today in the White House as some form of policy. I think the first one was that America, the United States, is overextended. We're carrying the burden by ourselves. Our allies should step up and, share some of the burden. It's time to come home and deal with problems in the U.S. Now, what's interesting about that is that this is not so far apart from President Obama. He was saying the same thing in the latter half of his second term. Not every problem, President Obama said, has or needs an American solution. Or as he put it more famously at a commencement address at West Point, even though we have the world's best hammer, doesn't mean we have to go out in search of every nail. Even Richard Nixon, way back in '69, the Guam Declaration, said the United States cannot be the world's policeman. So this is an element that's been present in American foreign policy. Nixon and Kissinger, by the way, decided to outsource the security of the Persian Gulf to what they called the Twin Towers. Those are not basketball players, by the way. Saudi Arabia and Iran. We know how that worked out. So that's one element. I think the other element that you heard a lot about, and frankly you heard again on the recent Asia trip, trade deals are unfair. We're getting ripped off. We need to do a better job. We need to make them fair and transparent, whatever that means in his mind. Trade deals need to be more transactional. We need to get away from all these complex and complicated things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was a major element. And thirdly, I think one of the things that Trump and his team were saying was, we need to move away from the global multilateral solutions in favor of the direct hands-on bilateral. Again, the transactional approach. Transactions are not the means to an end, they are the end. It's all about the now, what you can put on a bumper sticker, America first, and so forth. And what's interesting about this is that it has occasioned a major policy split in the White House. Two camps have emerged. One camp is what is called the nationalists, right? The nativists, some call them, led by names you may be familiar with, Steve Bannon and his acolyte Sebastian Gorka. It was this group that lobbied successfully President Trump to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Paris Climate Agreement. On the other hand, you have what are called the globalists, who believe, based on their experience, their personal convictions, that the United States must have a greater connectivity with the rest of the world. One other thing that occurred during, more recently, if you paid any attention to Trump's statement at the United Nations General Assembly, the UNGA. Normally, these are snooze fests. They're really a laundry list of long things that you'd like to get done but never will. Nobody really pays much attention. This one, however, was worth listening to. In it, he repeated the words sovereignty, state sovereignty, and nationalism. All right? I think he said it more than 20 times. So I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking to myself, well, if I close my eyes, listening to all this talk about nationalism, state sovereignty, we're sovereign in ourselves, I could be listening to Vladimir Putin. I could be listening to Xi Jinping. It sounded like a form of diplomatic Darwinism, survival of the fittest, strongest. What was also significant in that speech, sometimes when you hear a politician, you also have to listen, try and figure out what they didn't say. What he didn't say, or at least said only in passing, was any reference to the higher values that have animated American foreign policy. since our beginning. Things like human rights, things like liberty, democracy, humanitarian engagement. That was not present. It was all about the now, it was all about the deal, and it was all about sovereignty. Now, let me go back for just a moment to this split in the West Wing. It's like there's a demilitarized zone almost between them. And I think on the scorecard you might say the globalists are gaining the upper hand. But look, you saw this on the president's Asian trip. Let's review that briefly. In Japan and South Korea, the statements made by Trump's statement at the parliament in South Korea, in which he used for him a moderate language on the North Korea problem. I think at some point made some vague allusion to the fact maybe we could talk. Similarly in Japan, those speeches were drafted by the globalists. Those speeches came out of H.R. McMaster's National Security Office. But when the president got to China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, the tone shifted. If you're listening to any of them, those were big-time trade issues. We're getting royally shafted. We're being taken advantage of. At one point, Trump turned to Xi Jinping and said, yeah, you've taken advantage of it. You've done a good job on that, too. But it's the fault of previous administrations. Maybe you've heard something like that before. I've never heard those words coming out of the mouth of a U.S. president. That portion of the trip, which was night and day from the first portion, that came out of the nationalist wing. Even though Bannon and Gorka are not there, there's still plenty of acolytes hanging out that espouse these points of view. So there's this real tension in American foreign policy that is still playing itself out. I'd like to think that it will be resolved, but I'm not so sure it will. Now, the surprise in all of this, in some ways, is not that we have actions like the withdrawal of the Paris Climate Agreement or the decision to abruptly pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Rather, the surprise is that this administration, in many ways, this administration's foreign policy is not completely unanchored from previous administrations. I'll give you a few examples. China, the one China policy continues. You remember there was a brief flurry of speculation when President-elect Trump took a phone call from, I believe, the president of Taiwan. There was some speculation that Trump would separate in Taiwan from China. That has not happened, and I don't think it will happen. Trump has stated such directly to the president of China, first at the famous, you remember this, the Chocolate Cake Summit in Mar-a-Lago, the Trump, I don't know what they call it, Trump Resort, and again during another visit that they had. So I think I know that will continue. There are other issues with China. Sanctions on Russia. If anybody can explain to me the relationship between Trump and Putin, I'd love to hear it. But nevertheless, the sanctions will continue and are continuing if for no other reason that the Congress insists on that. In August, they passed a new package of sanctions, number one. Number two, they put language in controlling the president's ability to unilaterally place Soviet sanctions on Russia. So that's a form of a continuity. NATO. Remember NATO? NATO's obsolete. A bunch of freeloaders. We're paying the whole freight. And what are they doing? I remember this is an interesting behind the scenes. What happened was a number of people became alarmed by that. So you saw, roughly in succession, you saw Vice President Pence go to Brussels. You then saw the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, do the same thing, and then finally followed by Rex Tillerson, each of them reaffirming the importance of NATO to our overall security posture. That's a good thing, I think. In the Middle East, there was great speculation that we would ditch the Palestinians, move in favor of an Israeli solution. The two-state solution is continuing. In fact, during the Asian trip, it was announced that the administration would unveil in the new year a new plan for peace in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I'd love to see the details. As one who has suffered under this, it ain't going to be easy. But at least for now, it seems to be following in the tracks of previous administrations. Moreover, Trump said recently, and this is very important symbolically to the region, he would not be moving the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's a deal breaker. If that ever were to happen, you can forget about any chances of for peace. Iran. This is interesting. Trump vowed he would tear up, rip up the agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called nuclear accord. He did not do that yet, I have to add. What he did do was to respond to some U.S. domestic legislation, did not certify that the sanctions are in the best interest of the United States, and he punted this all over to the Congress. Congress has 60 days to come up with a solution. My enthusiasm is under control. Maybe I'm the only one who feels this way. I don't think they could take your dog for a walk around the block and come back with the same animal. Maybe that's just me. So, if I'm correct, and if there is this element of continuity, why is that? Given all the rhetoric we've heard, I think there are two reasons. The first reason is that I've been through transitions where new administrations come in. It's really quite remarkable in the United States. You have an administration of full power, full control on, let's say, January 21st, and then on noon, on that same day, boom, they're history, they're gone. New administration comes in. Two things generally happen in my view. I've witnessed Carter to Reagan, Bush to Clinton, and so forth and so on. Two things happen. One is a new administration will come in. Well, the funniest part I liked was when the Clinton administration, when the Bush administration came in after Clinton, removed all the W's from the keyboards. That was harmless. That was okay. What happens is an administration incoming, a new administration will say, my predecessor used to say it was black. It is white. All right? It's almost a knee-jerk type of thing. The other thing that a new administration will do, and this was without fail, they will come in with these elegant theories about how they're going to bring global peace about, bestow celestial benediction on the world. Great, elegant theories. And as night follows the day, they are assaulted by vicious gangs of facts. Or, as I like to say, mugged by reality. Here's a small example. I noticed this a couple of months ago. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, very powerful office because they control the money, reflecting the wishes of the president, said, we don't need all this money for the Federal Emergency Management Act, FEMA, NOAA, well, I don't know. It's a bit sketchy. Parts of EPA, we could drop that. Reality hit them. Tropical Storm Harvey. Then these successive waves causing great damage to many, many of our citizens. That's the last you've heard of it. So you have this, administrations talk a good game. They ultimately settle down in a path not so far. There are deviations, obviously. There are changes. But basically, the main lines and tenor of an administration's foreign policy will look something like the previous administration. Now, another reason why this happens is what the Washington Post and the New York Times have referred to as the presence of the adults. Now, if they say it, Washington Post, New York Times, it's right. These grown-ups would include Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. I would say right now he's probably the pivotal person in this administration. Keep your eyes on him. Secretary, the Chief of Staff, also a former general, Allen, the White House. H.R. McMaster, the President's National Security Advisor. He's got a tough job, and I think he has been able, let us say he has cleaned part of the stables at the NSC and gotten rid of some of the more extreme elements in that part of the White House. And even Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson, I think, would very much align himself with the globalists and with the adults. Tillerson, after all, tried to convince Trump to stay in the Paris Accords. Obviously, he wasn't listened to. But I think that's where he's coming from. Now, I have other problems with Tillerson that I'll get to in just a minute. But these people, in fact, I've been told, I can't prove it, so you just have to accept it on word, my faith. I'm told there's an agreement in Washington among those people I just named that one of them must be in Washington if the others are traveling. You understand why? Understand that the Senate last week had a hearing on the use, who can execute an order on the use of nuclear weapons. I'm not going to pursue that topic, but it's out there. And so I think you get the drift of what I'm trying to say here about the grown-ups, the presence of the grown-ups. Now, I have to say a few words about Tillerson, the Secretary of State at my former source of employment, where I spent 30 tender years. Lo and behold, and as Charlie was talking to you about my career, I said to myself, well, maybe now they understand why I took early retirement and came back to Montana. Tillerson did not want that job. It's a very prestigious job. He didn't want it. He didn't need it. It's got money, all kinds of money from the ExxonMobil time. He despises Washington. That much is obvious. Doesn't have much time for the media. That part is obvious because he's done a poor job in articulating both the domestic and foreign press what our goals and objectives are, who we are, what we stand for, etc. And he came to the U.S. State Department and proceeded to launch a massive reorganization plan. Now, I've been through reorganization plans. I've been part of them on a couple of occasions, once with Secretary of State Warren Christopher. They're not pleasant. They're uncomfortable. But Tillerson brought in a couple of high-priced consultants, did not take the time to check with the career people, and so it caused a great deal of apprehension. I was asked just a moment ago, what's morale like? It's -5, something like that. He launched this plan, and then he's made a mistake that many secretaries make. Some correct it, some realize, some don't, but they get better. And this is that he has separated himself completely from the rest of the building. He has in fact, people are disinvited from meetings. Our Director General came to a meeting thinking she was supposed to be there, and they wouldn't let her come in. I've never heard of that. I've never heard of that. And you rob yourself of their expertise. And oh, by the way, if something happens in Myanmar with the Rohingya, if something happens in Niger with ISIS, who's going to take care of that? I'm in charge. I'm the boss. That's what Trump said. I'm the only one that matters. Well, who's going to do that? And this is how bad it's gotten. 60% of our senior career ambassadors. Now, career ambassador is the most senior title in the diplomatic service. It is equivalent to 4-star general. All right? 60% of them have left, retired, transferred in the last 11 months. You see my point? There are 74 vacancies. Maybe I'm off a few numbers. 74 vacancies in the State Department. Not to mention the number of embassies abroad that don't have active ambassadors. We don't have an assistant secretary for Asia. We don't have an assistant secretary for Africa. Now, we have good career people that are filling in, but it's not the same because they have not been confirmed. They just don't carry the same authority. Nor do we have someone in the Middle East Bureau. Not much is happening in those regions, I agree, but you know. So maybe we can get by. But you tell me how we can have an active and dynamic foreign policy without diplomats. It ain't going to be easy. And on the other end of the spectrum, something that disturbs me equally is that our recruiting classes for the new Foreign Service officers, the second lieutenants, if you will, is off between 30 and 50%. So what I'm saying is this condition will not be corrected, if it is corrected, certainly not perhaps in this administration, for a matter of perhaps several years. So I guess the way I put it is this. The U.S. State Department today is like the Logan Pass Visitor Center at Glacier. It is closed for the season. It's a sad commentary. I never thought we'd see this day, but here we are. I can tell from the looks on your faces I've reached critical mass here, and I'm going to try and conclude this. Usually I like to provide some sort of a forecast or an estimate of something, how it may turn out. You know, I like to say in the Middle East, you think this is bad, you should hear me talk about the Middle East, by the way. Things will get worse before they get worse, all right? Maybe this will apply, maybe this will apply, that will apply to what we've been discussing. But it seems to me that the bottom line is that the global order that has endured for 70 years, the liberal international global order, much of which the United States helped build, is, to put it, is unraveling. And the word that troubles me the most in international affairs is vacuum. Because I've seen this all the time in the Middle East. When you have a vacuum, someone fills that. So we may be entering a new era, an era that's so new it doesn't even have a name, and I can't give it to you. The general impression in the world today is that the United States is pulling back, is retreating, retrenching. That may not be a fair statement, but that's the impression. That's what matters. And even worse, the impression is the United States is adrift. It is adrift. We need to stay informed, stay engaged, question our leaders. We have campaigns every now and then. It's always surprised me how few questions we ask of our Montana leaders. I'm talking about our congressmen and senators. Over the past several electoral cycles, I've had a standing bet that there would never be more than 3 questions in the entirety of the debates about foreign policy. And I've never lost until last year, and there may be 4 or 5, I don't know. But that's a problem. We need to be engaged, and we need, again, as I would say, to be informed. So I am going to conclude at this point. And I appreciate, again, I want to end the way I started by thanking all of you for coming, for supporting these programs. It means a lot to us. Very proud of the things we've done with our Academic World Quest. We have a Council on the Radio program, which reaches something like 25,000 households, probably one of the largest talk show components in the state. You've heard about our Academic World Quest, and our distinguished speakers, with one exception, have been pretty good. Okay? So thank you all very much. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a few questions. That means I'm going to take a few questions. And then we will have some microphones. I see we have some students. I'm assuming you're from students. Yeah? Do you have any questions? Do you care? Is it important? I don't mean to put you on the spot. That's not fair. Yes. Speak up. I'll relay.
For someone considering a career in foreign service, but a little concerned about this reorganization,
Yeah.
what advice would you have for someone in the early stage?
You all heard this. Someone thinking about a career in the foreign service, what advice would I give? It's the best time possible. I'll tell you why. Because if people are bailing out and you're good, you want to be there. Number one. Number two, you don't want somebody else to make your decisions. And that's what will happen if you decide not to go. Now, I'll address your question about the mess of the State Department. Hopefully this is cyclical and it will improve. I know from a fact that junior officers normally, the Secretary of State does not come to his office in the morning and say, oh, staff, do we have a new member from Montana? Oh, please hasten them to come and see me so that I can avail myself of their wisdom. It doesn't, I'm not trying to be flip here. It doesn't work that way. But you learn your trade, you learn your craft, and by the way, it's a great job if you have a short attention span. Because no 2 days are the same. If you want to make a difference, the Foreign Service is a career. I'll be happy to talk to you at some point if you're interested.
Ambassador Johnson, you mentioned that the failure to fill posts within the State Department has impacted seriously, and there's been a great deal of publicity about that.
Yes.
Can you explain why the failure to fill posts, how that impacts the ability of the State Department to function?
Well, it affects it not only from the standpoint of looking at it from Washington, but from the standpoint of overseas. When you don't have a career ambassador. When you don't have a career ambassador in a U.S. embassy, it means he or she is automatically outranked by ambassadors from other countries. That's the way protocol of diplomacy works. So the message, the voice of the American government as transmitted to them is muted, all right? Now, in Washington, to be sure, there's room for improvement. Some of the staffing, some of it is overstaffing, some of it is duplicative. The problem is it's a fundamental lack of trust. This administration, and I have to say other administrations as well, have looked at the career staff as disloyal, right? Who do they support? Because these people come in, they've just been through 6, 8, 12, 14 months of grueling partisan battles. So that's in their mind. Who are these people? Can we trust them? The fact of the matter is that career ambassador, well, any foreign service officer takes an oath to the Constitution. Point of fact, I served under 2 presidents that were impeached. Can you think who they were? Yes, you can. Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was impeached but not convicted. It didn't change my job in one bit because I was loyal to the system and to the Constitution and to the American people. In some ways it did. But when you don't have a full staff and the amount of issues that comes across a person's desk is it's just at light speed. Now, as I said before, how in the world are Rex Tillerson and Donald Trump going to solve these problems in a manner they deem? They have to have a competent staff. What I did was I always played a little game with Washington. If I had a position, I want to do something, I would say, here's my position, here are the reasons I'm going to take it. Oh, by the way, if I don't hear from you in 24 hours, I'm going to do this. Worked every time. Worked every time. And there was no need for them. Here's how bad it is. For every country has a national day. Ours happens to be the 4th of July. So on the National Day of the Czech Republic, there is a letter that is sent, one from the President and one from the Secretary of State. These are really pro forma. You put in some nice language, you know, offer my congratulations on the 38th anniversary, the people of the Czech Republic. Tillerson wouldn't refuse to clear those. He had to review every one. It's absurd. Was his level of distrust that much? You know, Tillerson had, it's not unique. I'm told that when Tillerson was at ExxonMobil, he physically created a separate office as he was attempting to do the State Department. He was attempting to remodel the executive suites and create a space, a special space, that where only he and his trusted aides would be allowed to go. He did that at ExxonMobil, and they referred to it as the God Pod. So you cannot have an active diplomacy in this environment with these staffing gaps. It just won't work, and we will pay the price. One of the reasons that Rex Tillerson made for staying in the Paris Climate Agreement, we don't have to agree with it. Obviously we don't. But at least we have a seat at the table, and we can talk to these people. Same thing with the Trans-Pacific. 11 countries, a major trade agreement. After all, wasn't it the U.S. that led the way in international trade agreements, opening up, liberalizing? But we don't want to be there because it's all about us and the nationalistic approaches. I see a hand wave. Yes, I'm sorry.
I'd like to focus on China for a moment.
Yeah.
I'm repeatedly hearing and reading that they do have a long-term strategy. And because they don't have a shift of power every 4 to 8 years, they are able to maintain this focus, and their goal,
right,
I keep reading and hearing, is that within 25 to 30 years, they will be the only superpower. Now, how is America, who politicians on either side these days will say or do anything to get elected?
Yeah.
The two parties are so polarized that the minute one administration, as you said, goes out, another one comes in, everything changes. We have no long-term strategy. How do we rectify that?
Well, here I would refer you to Winston Churchill, who said, actually I don't think he said it, but still a good quote. The American people will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. This is a real problem. You heard this in Beijing. If you listen to Trump's speech, it was this stuff about unfair, unjust trade deals. Oh, you took advantage of us, Mr. President, but you did a good job. It wasn't your fault, it was the previous. When Xi Jinping spoke, and the same thing happened at APEC, he gave a global statesman-like address. He talked about connectivity. He talked about issues like cyber things, and he was very effective. So the world will listen to him. And as I said when I referred to the vacuum, I don't claim to be a China expert, but we are saying China has already started its move into that vacuum. Russia, I think, is more handicapped and has less ability. But China, as you say, has a major economy, second largest in the world, is rapidly developing its military. And he said something else that would have caused previous administrations, I think, probably to faint. He said, oh, the Pacific Ocean, it's big enough for all of us. As you know, and people on Air Force One were amazed at how long it took to fly over that territory where China has built ostensibly defensive fortifications. So, we'll do the last one. Go ahead.
And I would just say that on that note, that democracies are inherently short-sighted because we care about the next election more than we care about the long term, whereas autocracies tend to have a little bit a longer perspective. But my question is, so I've been in international affairs for many years and made a career out of it, and I worked with U.S. government for decades. And my problem with what's happening with foreign policy is this lack of real long-term stuff. So I just ended my 10 years with USAID,
Oh, yeah.
Agency for International Development.
Yeah.
Although I've worked for 30 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I don't know if that's a good thing.
That's a good
that It's ended. But nonetheless, people are saying, why are you leaving? Why are you leaving? And I said, you know, the world is moving on to huge issues, climate change and population and, you know, you name it, and we are not dealing with them.
Yeah.
And I'll just cut this short, but one colleague of mine said, yes, I went to a CIA briefing, and it was the only time in our organization in which we listened to somebody saying, wow, there are big issues in front of us in the world that we're blindsided by the short-term democracy needing to be reelected. So we deal with the short-term stuff, not the big stuff.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm going to deal with the big stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about your response to that. Foreign policy itself is about this administration. So just would love to open that up to you.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, let's put it to you bluntly this way. In the next 20 years, there will be more changes than there have been in the last 100 years. That's the way the world is moving. And we are going to be confronting something called the crisis of space. It is something the Israelis have had to deal with. There are now Hezbollah units, maybe 15 miles from northern Syria. That's what they mean by crisis of space. What I think I mean, because I'm not an expert, is that with this cyber activity, I mean, look at the elections. Look at that. You know, France was about to go to paper ballots because they couldn't trust the integrity of their system. Maybe it was the Netherlands. That is a problem. People are thinking about that, smart people. But what trust can you have when you look at Facebook and some of the other, you know, mega corporations that deal with this kind of data? Nothing's safe, really, it seems, appears to me from my naive standpoint. So the State Department at one point had a very active and effective long-term planning unit. It would do just what you said. They would sit back and say, okay, in 20 years, where will China be? Where will we be? The Pentagon does this to a certain extent. The Pentagon has not yet succumbed to the partisan pressures that other parts of the U.S. government have had to. Mattis is a strategic thinker, first class, and so is H.R. McMaster. You know, these guys as younger officers cut their teeth on the edges of Vietnam. And it's a lesson that they've learned, and I think they are very frustrated. And I just hope they're going to stay around because they're our front line of defense, to put it mildly. So, well, thank you all for coming out.